Hello and welcome to the channel. In this episode we travel from Purmamarca across the border to San Pedro de Atacama, Chile. There was a feeling of nervous anticipation on the day, as this was to be our first crossing of the Andes and an ascent to an altitude of approximately 4,800 meters above sea level at Jama Pass. I was anxious that we would be feeling the effects of altitude, and that if either of us were feeling sick, we would have no option but to turn back to a lower altitude. However, we had acclimatized well in the previous days, and apart from a slight feeling of lightheadedness, we both felt fine. The day dawned fine, and we followed the valley up before a steady climb up numerous switchbacks to the famous monument at Jujuy, 4,170 meters above sea level, for some photos before it was back on the road to beat any tourist buses to the border and avoid any long queues. We descended for a while before crossing the salt flats at Salinas Grandes at an altitude of 3,450 metres, and I flew the drone. Salinas Grandes covers an area of 212 square kilometres and is controversially being partially mined for lithium. We continued on through a desert landscape, past the occasional settlement to the town of Sasquez at 3,896 metres. We passed the town without stopping, but stopped for fuel at the only petrol station a few kilometres past the town. We carried on to the border without stopping, as there were a couple of tourist buses behind us and we didn't want to have to queue at the border behind them for a couple of hours. Border control was quick and easy. Once the paperwork was done, we only had to wait 20 minutes for a cursory inspection of our bags for any food, and then we were on our way again. Shortly after the border, we crossed the pass and the highest point of the day at Jama Pass, 4,831 metres. Although the day was fine, the altitude and a cold wind made an extra layer of clothes essential for a comfortable ride. The temperature was about 10 degrees Celsius. Many kilometres passed, and the scenery was breathtaking, with multicoloured and textured mountains plus brilliant white salt flats and azure lakes, which passed us by before the volcano of Kabir came into sight in the long descent of 2,380 metres from the high plains down to our destination of San Pedro de Atacama. It took a while and a few detours to find our accommodation for the night, which was a few kilometres out of town, and through some tricky roadworks that took us down through a sandy riverbed. We stayed in a yurt, which was different but very comfortable. We didn't stay any longer than one night for any of the tourist attractions, which mainly consist of thermal pools and geysers. We have seen these at home in New Zealand, so weren't prepared to make the 200-kilometre round trip. Instead, we had a good night's rest in preparation for the next day, where we head down to Antofagasta, where we finally cross the continent and stay on the shores of the Pacific Ocean.